Welcome once again to Lehto's Law. Here's Steve Lehto.
Homeowners associations are something we talk about quite a bit on this channel. And a lot of people in America live in homeowners associations or situations where there's an organization that, while they aren't the government, they can have a big impact on your life and how they govern what you do in your day-to-day activities. So here's a story. A lot of people sent this, including David. It's from the U.S. Sun, but also reported elsewhere. Homeowner rages over new HOA rule dictating what he can do inside his own home, and he's lived there for 25 years without an issue prior to this. So Arshi Qureshi wrote this. He's upset because they say he cannot smoke in his own home. The man's name is Bill. He's caught off guard when his HOA banned residents from smoking inside their homes. The rule restricts smoking to a designated outdoor area. It was passed at the HOA's annual meeting by a majority vote. So that does raise the first interesting point here. If you're a member of an HOA, you have the right to vote on rules. If they have rules that are silly and enough people don't like them, you can get the rules changed. But when a bunch of people pass a rule and you're in the minority on it, that's a problem. And the question is this even legal? Can they tell you what to do in your own home if it affects nobody outside of your home? So the man says his wife does smoke and she's struggling with this. He called the HOA rule unfair, pointing out how it was never an issue until now. In the letter to the Sun Sentinel, where this is first reported, he said, "I've lived here for 25 years. No one has ever had a problem with my wife smoking." And the question, of course, is if these are detached homes, like there's a home and a yard, and there's a homeowners association over the entire place, why would it affect anybody if you're smoking inside your own house? So that's one question. He says, now they're telling us we can't smoke in our own home. In response to this, a writer for the newspaper confirmed that smoking bans have been a growing trend in HOAs for years. Apparently, it's been a thing. For the last decade or so, the prohibition has been expanded to limited common elements. He said the more recent trend of banning smoking within the units is still untested in the courts. And that's the question, is if they pass a rule and you decide that you don't like that rule and you were to contest it and you wound up in court, would a judge let you get away with this, or would you say, no, the rule's the rule? So this means that while the rules may seem reasonable to some, it's still unclear whether it would hold up legally, as has not been tested. He added that smoking bans in common areas have been upheld due to well-known health risks. And so a common area is something that's owned basically by everyone in the association, everyone gets to use. Not uncommon that there'll be a big development and there'll be like a park in the middle. Who owns the park? Well, you all do, but you all own it collectively. So they have rules regarding that. And they might say you have to pick up after your dog if your dog does its business in the park. And if there's a pickleball court, you might be allowed to use that pickleball court. But there might be rules as to when you can use it and so on. So he added that these have been well known for the common areas. But the question is whether it will hold up inside your individual unit. Now, keep in mind, it's possible that the man could be someplace where there are attached, like, say, townhouses. I lived for a while in a condominium, and the condominium had common areas outside, and it had an association. It was a condo association, but condo associations are very, very similar to HOAs. Now, in my condo, I would have been allowed to smoke if I had smoked. But I had common walls with two other neighbors. And I had a neighbor who smoked who would sit outside on a lawn chair right outside her door and smoked like a chimney. And if my kitchen window was open, it would drift into my unit. Now, I knew her, and I would just walk over and close my windows, no big deal. But that would make sense that there'd be an issue there because the smoke was affecting me. Like I said, I didn't complain. I'm simply pointing out that if these are detached homes with a yard around them, if somebody's inside their own home smoking, how are they possibly affecting their neighbors or other members of the association? So each individual's rights would have to be balanced, says the man writing for the paper. If the unit shares ventilation systems, a smoking ban could make sense. Of course, yes, that would make sense. However, if the unit is self-contained with its air filtration system, the ban might be harder to justify. And they point out that courts are likely going to consider whether smoking disturbs anybody else People have the right to live the way they want inside their own homes, but doing so should not harm their neighbors. So I'll give you an example. I remember being home and my neighbor on the one side playing music really, really loud. And, these are issues that pop up with neighbors. If the HOA here enforces a new rule, they can do it in the same way they handle other rule violations. First, he could get a warning letter. Then he could face fines. The fines can escalate. And, of course, the fines can be a lien against his property. So if the resident still insists on smoking or testing this, the association could go to court, and a judge would ultimately make the decision. And the question then becomes, would a judge rule that this is okay or not okay? So the outcome of that case could set a precedent for similar disputes in the future, but it's going to take someone to go to court and test this. Otherwise, it might just spread. I don't know what the deal is, but it seems that a lot of the people who are on the HOA boards like having power, and they're often on what appears to be a power trip. That is, they like telling other people how to live their lives. And I was actually on the condo board for a couple of years in my place. And I remember before I was on the condo board, there was a member who insisted that once a month, the condo board would go out and walk around the entire complex. It's quite large. And they'd walk around, and one of them had a clipboard and a pencil. And she'd write down all the violations they saw. And then she'd see to it they sent letters to every single person. And the weird thing is that when I was on the condo board, we didn't do that. And if somebody complained and said, hey, my neighbor's doing this, and we looked into it, and it turns out they were doing it, and it was a violation of the rules, we'd send a letter. And I don't think we ever took it one step beyond that. Or if we did, it was only because of an egregious violation. But the point is that we were not looking for violations. And I've heard other stories of people who told me that, the association representatives were walking around and leaning up and looking over fences and looking through cracks in the fence, trying to see what's going on in your backyard. And if they're looking for violations that nobody has called in about, who cares? So more and more communities are moving to regulate smoking inside private homes for the health and comfort of the residents. But the point is that if I live there by myself, or I live there with my spouse, or I live there with my spouse and my children, the smoking in the house, I would think, should be regulated by the adults therein. Okay? But a court would have to weigh in and make the final decision. So the article here from the U.S. Sun has this handy little thing that says 1 in 5 Americans live in an area with a homeowners association or an HOA. And what is that? Well, an HOA is a homeowners association. The organization aims to maintain a clean and cohesive place to live for its residents. It also maintains the common elements, things like that. Entire neighborhoods, subdivisions, condominiums, family homes, or townhouses within a planned development will often make up an HOA. They also act as a governing body for tenants who run and fund the HOA through monthly fees. And it is like a little government. They hold elections. They have a board. The board often has a chairperson. And the board sets the rules, enforces the rules, and oversees the running of the HOA. Their principal aims are to keep the community functioning and visually appealing and to maintain property values. And those are all good things, obviously. But the big thing here is what really affects the property values. Because I've heard people say things like, they come by and they say, hey, your bushes need to be trimmed. You're not allowed to plant that kind of bush, by the way. And I've mentioned before, I've actually heard, and this is not uncommon, that the drapes inside your house, if they're the wrong color and they can be seen from the outside of the house, you have to change them and make them match. I'm not making that one up. They primarily focus on common areas such as roads, parks, and pools, but they may also stipulate what you can do on your own or with your own property, such as the yards and the driveways. They often have restrictions about the uniformity of the properties. For example, ensuring most houses look the same and the driveways are clear of weeds. Keep in mind, I did a story about a year ago or so about a woman who had her house repainted. And the HOA apparently involves a lot of homes that are multicolored. That is, they're not all the same color. And somebody came by her house one day and said, hey, you painted your house this color. It's the wrong color. She goes, no, it's, the same color as the house down the street. And they broke out the old color palette and they said, no, you're off by a couple of degrees on the shade. And they said, what's the name of this paint? Show us the paint code from like Home Depot or wherever you got it from. And she had something and she showed them the paint code. And they go, no, this is not the same. And it turns out that the HOA had a palette of, 8 or 9 colors you're allowed to paint. Pick any one as long as it's one of these 8 or 9. And she had picked a color close, but it wasn't identical. And they said, you have to repaint your house. Or every day you don't repaint it, we're going to start fining you. So keep in mind that an HOA should have a rule book of covenants, conditions, and restrictions. And it's something you should get when you move in or when the place is built. And then an elected volunteer board of directors enforces the regulations. And keep in mind, I've mentioned this before, I have a lot of people in response to these videos say, you know something, Steve? If I lived in a place like that, I tell the HOA to go F themselves, and they can't do a darn thing about it. Oh, yes, they can. When you start breaking the rules, they can start fining you. And as the fines stack up, they can slap a lien on your property, and they can foreclose on your property. And a court will uphold it. And people go, but Steve, that's not fair. How can that be fair? Well, the reason it's fair is that you moved into the HOA knowing it was an HOA. Now, I've had a couple people tell me, they go, Steve, you know something? I bought into a place. I didn't know it had an HOA. I can tell you in the state of Michigan, they have a specific law that requires a seller of real estate to inform the buyer, yes, HOA or no HOA. And it's on a form that's mandated by the state of Michigan, and they have to give you this form, and it has that question on it. Is this property in an HOA? Yes or no? And so if someone checks the no box and sells you a property that is, you got an action against them. But if they check the yes box, then you know what you're getting yourself into. And I've had a lot of people go, but Steve, I didn't know what that meant. I didn't know. Most HOAs require a seller to give you a copy of the bylaws. And many times the bylaws are incorporated into the deeds of the property, such that if a person does a title search, they'll see where it says, this property is in an HOA governed by the by rules and bylaws, blah, 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 blah. And anybody who's done their homework should see that language and go, oh, it's in an HOA. Let's get a copy of these bylaws. And somebody can contact the HOA board and say, hey, we're looking at a piece of property inside your HOA. Can we get a copy of the bylaws? Oh, and trust me, they've got the bylaws because they want you to have them because they want you to follow them. And now, don't get me wrong, if you're on an HOA, on a power trip, you might enjoy finding people who are breaking the rules. But when I was on the board of the condo association, I liked the idea of us just coming in, talking about emergencies we had to deal with, such as some common element had a problem, and then looking at the budget to make sure we had enough money in the budget to do things we needed to do. And that was basically it. I liked the meetings to be nice and short. I didn't like the big 3-hour, 4-hour-long meetings. I wasn't getting paid. So that's what's going on there. But apparently now some HOAs are actually passing rules saying you cannot smoke inside your own home. It has not been tested by a court yet, and that's the real question, is how enforceable is that if it's a standalone home versus if it's an attached unit, like say townhouses that have common walls. How enforceable is it, and what will happen? We'll have to wait and see, but this right here might be a rule too far for the HOAs. Sean, thanks for sending that from MSN.com. And David, thanks for sending that from US Sun. Homeowner rages over new HOA rule dictating what he can do inside his own home. He's been there for 25 years. Now they tell him he can't smoke inside his own house. And yeah, what happened there a second ago is I've got 2 stories in front of me. And this is the story I'm doing now. This is the story I'm about to do. I swapped them. I'm good now. Questions or comments, put them below. Let's talk to you later. Bye-bye.
Thank you for watching Lehto's Law.
The beaten path is the safest, but the traffic's terrible.